afternoon and welcome back. I'm Arthur Peter. For centuries, the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas Aquinas has shaped and, frankly, in a lot of ways, defined the language of Catholic theology and philosophy. Aquinas' work is unmatched in terms of his insights into questions of God, humanity, the path to salvation, the moral life, but its vast scope and intricate arguments can make it daunting for modern readers. Enter the Summa Illuminated, a guide to St. Thomas Aquinas' masterpiece. This is by Father Cajetan Cuddy. Father Cajetan Cuddy, like I mentioned, he's the author of this amazing book. Father, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Well, I'm glad to be able to speak with you again, and I want to begin by asking you to speak to. We all know the brilliance of St. Thomas Aquinas. I think everyone listening knows him as a crystalline scholastic mind. I want to ask you to speak to the impact he has had, even upon those who are not familiar with his work.
So the impact of St. Thomas Aquinas is traceable back, of course, to, as you've already just said, his native brilliance, which was a gift from God, and also, as you know and imply in what you just said, the many gifts of grace and of faith that God gave him. So combining his native brilliance and his profound graces that God freely gave to him, St. Thomas was profoundly a contemplative, which means that he stared, so to speak, with a penetrating and loving gaze into the depths of God. And because of that, Thomas was not content merely to describe or to consider or to see God in one aspect or another, but St. Thomas's true brilliance, and the reason why he has had an almost unparalleled influence in the history of Christian thought, not just Catholic, but all thinkers, even from different religions and denominations, is that he, in an almost unparalleled way, laid out the big picture, the comprehensive summary of all of the main tenets, doctrines, and essential truths of the Christian faith. So he did not say everything about God that can be said, because that's not possible. But unlike even other saints, other doctors, no other theologian and Christian doctor in history provided such a reliable and accurate and a faithful summary of the whole of the Christian faith. And so it's that integral unity, that big picture comprehensivity, which I believe accounts first and foremost for his perennial and enduring value.
Now, because of that, Father, like you rightly mentioned, he didn't endeavor to write everything about God. That would be an impossible task. How did he structure his Summa? What is the brilliance behind the structuring of the Summa?
The brilliance behind the structure of the Summa in all of its, hundreds and hundreds of pages is, of course, within those hundreds and hundreds of pages. But as you rightly and insightfully and wisely highlight, the real genius of Aquinas is in the method by which he progresses through those hundreds of pages and the shape around which those hundreds of pages are found. And so here we talk about the outline and structure of the Summa. So I like to say, with other scholars that have wisdom from God and have studied St. Thomas and his wisdom, that if Aquinas had not been a theologian or a philosopher, he would have been an architect, which means that he is the master blueprint designer. So this cashes out in this regard, namely, that the order of the questions and topics and doctrines that Aquinas considers, what comes before, what comes after, what's in the middle, St. Thomas teaches us first and foremost through the order and through the structure of the Summa, such that even the outline of the Summa Theologica is a pedagogical text. It's teaching. And what we find in a word in the order of the Summa is that God is the center and the subject of sacred theology. And so Aquinas' Summa is from beginning to end God-oriented, God-originating, God-terminating, God-informed, And so if there's one word that dominates not just the points or the topics that Aquinas considers, but the very shape, structure, and form of the Summa Theologiae, his masterpiece, it's God. And no other Catholic theologian has basically had the God blueprint so evidently and overtly guiding his writing, like St. Thomas Aquinas.
You'll pardon me if I use the term Thomists. For most of us Thomists, when we think about the writings, especially the Summa, we think about the overarching structure of the exitus and the reditus, and those are terms used in philosophy and in Catholic theology. Can you help us understand what those terms mean and how that applies to the way Aquinas thought about the order of the Summa?
So it's a good question, and you need no pardon for using the title Thomist as someone who follows St. Thomas Aquinas. That's a compliment. But I ask for your pardon because the idea of exitus reditus is a modern thing that is not actually, that was invented in 1930s. It doesn't actually find origin in the Summa Theologiae. It does not appear in the Summa. And so what I would argue, or what St. Thomas himself says, is that the order of the Summa is studying all things in relation to God rather than the creature. The idea of exitus reditus, if I'll just say a 10-second thing, was an idea in 1930s that came about that said that, well, if we can look at the Summa like all things proceed from God, exitus, exit God, all things return to God. The problem with this, although it's a helpful kind of way of thinking, is that it inadvertently, subtly, yet significantly, makes the creature the subject of theology, because the creature is the one that exits God, exitus, and returns to God. If we look at the structure of the Summa, and particularly in the prologue to the second question of the Summa, and in the prologue to the Secunda Pars, the second part of the Summa, Aquinas explains that the structure of the Summa proceeds according to God as exemplar, namely God as the form, as the structure, as the master blueprint himself of all that is. That's the first part. And the second part considers creation as imaged God, the imago Dei. And finally, the third part, which considers our Lord Jesus Christ and the sacraments that our Lord Jesus instituted. Why does Jesus come at the end? In the third and final part, it's because the eternal Word made man, Jesus, as Thomas says in the third part, is himself both the exemplar because he's God and the image because he's the eternal Word, the eternal Son. And so what we see in the actual structure that St. Thomas identifies in the Summa is God as exemplar, God as cause, God as end, God is formal cause, the imago Dei, for showing us that we resemble God in a creaturely manner as made in his image, and that Jesus, who is God and who is man, he is both creator and redeemer, comes in the third part. So as we can see again, the entire structure of the Summa is God, God, God in all three of its three parts. And in my book, as you no doubt already know, and our readers or our listeners could perhaps see, I try to break this down in light of the text of Aquinas himself. It's a subtle structure, but it's not a secret or a hidden structure. He's pretty overt about it.
And we have about 30 seconds. I'm talking with Father Cajetan Cuddy. He is a Dominican priest. Oh, Father, I'm proud to share with you, my bride and I are in formation to be lay Dominicans now.
Oh, wonderful. Good. Wonderful.
My guest is Father Cajetan Cuddy. He is the author of the Summa Illuminated. This is a very helpful preaches, a kind of guide to entering into and wading in the waters of the Summa Theologiae, penned by St. Thomas Aquinas as an instruction to beginners in the contemplation of theology. We are continuing on the other side of the break to talk with Father Cajetan Cuddy, but I also want to greatly encourage everyone listening right now to glean from Father Cuddy's wisdom here and to be bold enough to take a few steps forward in looking at the works of St. Thomas Aquinas if you never have before. And therefore, getting a copy of the Summa Illuminated would be a great tool to help you do so. Once again, continuing on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peace. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Father Cajetan Cuddy, author of the Summa Illuminated, a guide to St. Thomas Aquinas' masterpiece. So, Father, I dropped a little bit of the wisdom found in your book about, and by the way, this is how Aquinas thought of his Summa, about the Summa Theologiae being the instruction for beginners. Undoubtedly, we have people listening right now thinking, what on earth are you talking about? So what am I talking about, Father?
It's a good question. I know we've all said, oh, this is written for beginners. Perfect. And we pull it up on our iPhone, or we sit down with a copy of it, and then we are immediately lost. What does Aquinas mean by beginners? Well, there's two things. First, when he means beginners in sacred theology, he does mean those that are just beginning the work, truly beginners of sacred theology. What is sacred theology? The work of faith, seeking understanding. God reveals to us, we receive in faith divine truths which exceed our natural discovery. And once we have these truths, like the Trinity, like creation, like the incarnation, like the sacraments, it's natural, it's connatural, it's a graced activity to begin to try to understand those divinely revealed truths. That's sacred theology. So it's a book, the Summa Theologiae is a unified book written for beginners beginning that work, but they are not beginners in the sense that they had not already studied many things. And so the beginners of sacred theology during the time of St. Thomas Aquinas were basically already masters, proficient masters in the science of philosophy. And what does philosophy study? Philosophy studies being and reality according to reason alone. And why is that important? It's because if God reveals something to us, for example, like in the Eucharist, this is my body, that's a divine truth. But if we don't know what the word is means, or what being is, which is a natural thing, we're not going to be able to understand what the sacred is of the Eucharist in transubstantiation. This is my body means. So Aquinas is presupposing that his readers are already quite familiar with the discipline of natural being, philosophy, so that they are now beginning and ready to study divine being, sacred theology. And the second thing we see, he structures, back to the structure, the Summa is structured so that those who are beginning sacred theology follow a very organized series of questions and topics that are meant to build upon each other in a systematic way so that the student is not confused by random details, random questions, but there's an ordered unity, a wisdom that informs the structure, the outline of the Summa. So that's what the Summa, that's why it's for beginners. It's beginners in sacred theology, not philosophy, and it's structured so that those beginners in sacred theology can easily read it from beginning to end and see the logical, the supernatural logical, the theologic, the God logic unfold throughout its many pages and its subsequent parts.
From there, Father, if we may look at kind of the pragmatic approach to the reading of the Summa, modern man is so impatient. We tend to skip over things like introductions. Nobody reads manuals anymore. At least I think I've been told nobody reads manuals. And yet the prologues of the Summa and in all of the beginning treatises, those are crucial ways to help us form major paradigms and sub-paradigms of how St. Thomas Aquinas is thinking.
Absolutely true. That's one of my contributions, I think, in this little book, is to emphasize that in these little, often like only a couple sentence long transitions from one topic to another, Aquinas gives us the cheat codes, so to speak, to the book, where he says, now that I've said this, and he just summarizes in a sentence what he just did in like 50 pages, now we're going to look at this, and I'm going to say this, and he kind of anticipates in a few words what he'll do in the next 50 pages. So, yeah, what I think would be helpful is if someone's intimidated by the Summa, if all they did was read the little paragraph at the beginning of every section, they would come away with a really masterful, coherent, and intelligible, understandable overview of everything that he's doing. He's very good at showing in these transition prologues, these introductions, what came before and what came after or will come after.
Now, from there, then, let's talk about the concept of the Summa, the driving force, which is the question of sacred doctrine. How does Aquinas think about sacred doctrine as the work of theology?
Aquinas thinks of sacred doctrine as the foundation, the crux, the nut, the origin, the principle of sacred theology. So not everyone needs to be a theologian in the sense that we don't all have to read big books. We don't have to do scholastic questions. We don't have to be masters of logic or of exegesis. But we all have to receive sacred doctrine, sacra doctrina, which means divine revelation, which means divine truths, which are encapsulated in the creeds of the church that we recite, particularly and most potently in the liturgy on Sunday and solemnities. So that's divine revelation. Everyone needs to know that I believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. That's the saving truths of faith. And that, however, leads to sacred theology, which is the work of our seeking to understand what does it mean for God to be Father? What does it mean for him to be Creator? What does it mean for the eternal Word, the eternal Son to become man? How is he a creature? Is he a creature? But he's God. He can't be a creature. That the asking of what does the faith mean? What does Sacra Doctrina mean? What does God's holy teaching mean? Divine revelation mean? That's the work of sacred theology. And so the divine revelation, which is sacred doctrine, leads to the work of the theologian, which says, now that God has revealed this to us, let's love him with our mind and try to figure out what he means.
From there, Father, in that very first question of the Summa, you learn this wondrous declaration that theology, or at least sacred doctrine, is the queen of the sciences. Every other science finds its real meaning when it stands under the auspices of sacred doctrine. I remember presenting that to a high school that I worked at, and I was met with some of the strangest looks. It was as if everyone thought, no, the science department is the highest of the sciences. So I'm glad you see where I'm going with this. So please speak into that, Father, why we as Catholics have to rethink that hierarchy of science and truth.
It's a good question. The first thing is science, or in Latin, scientia, is one of the most important words in the entire Latin lexicon or dictionary, because science means certain knowledge through causes. That's what science is. It's certain knowledge discovered or proven or demonstrated in light of causes. And it's necessary. It's not just conjectural. Now, in our modern lexicon, we think of science with regard to laboratories, to testing, to repetition of experiments. And that is a scientific process, a scientific expression. But when we say that science, the theology is the queen of the sciences, the reason why it has to be the highest is because God in faith gives us himself as the highest causes. So while the natural scientists can discover things about gravity, about molecules, and about atoms, and that is truly science, and that is truly important, we can demonstrate and discover truths. The reason why theology has to be the highest science is because we're not starting from naturally known causes or effects, but we're starting with God's truth, the highest cause itself, who himself directly reveals his own causality and what he has effected in creation and in the world.
If I may jump ahead to a few more questions down, there's a reason why we call St. Thomas Aquinas the angelic doctor, and it's more reasons than just one. We're running out of time in this segment, so just share with us, Father, why do we call him the angelic doctor?
Numerous reasons. Historically, first and foremost, Aquinas wrote one of the most complete, intricate, compelling, and exhaustive presentations of the angels. The angels intrigue everyone, and yet often it falls into almost myth and superstition with many people. Thomas was not into that. And so he said, okay, based on divine revelation, based on reason, what can we know for sure with certitude, science again, about the angels? That's the first reason. He wrote one of the most masterful treatments in the Summa of the angels. Secondly, the more pure one is, the more angelic, so to speak, one is, the more like God one is, even as a creature, the more one is able to see. And because Aquinas had such an angelic soul, such a pure soul, such a pellucid soul, he was able to see with great lucidity and clarity and radiance, like the angels, so to speak, analogically. We call him the angelic doctor because he saw so much, even as a creature of the divine being, of the God himself, of the divine refulgence.
In consideration of all of that, then, Father, as a final exhortation, I know we barely scratched the surface of your book, let alone the brilliance of the Summa, an encouragement of having our listeners approach the work of St. Thomas Aquinas and how to do so.
So the first thing is, we all did it poorly at the beginning, so do not feel like you're doing something wrong. Everyone, from the most genius Thomist scholars, the student of Aquinas in history, to you and me, we all had to begin just by, stumbling along. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage people, read what you find interesting. Look at the I Answer That, where Aquinas gives usually the longest part of each article of the Summa, where he gives his position. Look at the prologue and begin. Find what's interesting. Look at the questions. Find answers. And then if you wish to do it more systematically, you can read it from beginning to end, which is how Aquinas envisioned. And my little book, the Summa Illuminated, might help with that.
Father, tremendous joy and honor. Thank you very much for making the time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My guest has been Father Cajetan Cuddy. He is the author of the Summa Illuminated, and this truly is an outstanding book that gives you a guide to St. Thomas Aquinas' Masterpiece, published by Ave Maria Press. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.